No problem. So that's absolutely fine. So before we continue, I just kind of quickly like to, because we are touching upon that particular perennial question, what is human nature? As you know, philosophy is trying to answer that question for more than 3,000 years. And only in the last probably 30 years or so, cognitive sciences are actually telling us exactly what's happening inside our minds, like scientifically proven. So I would just kind of quickly like to frame whatever I'm saying with this particular image. Can you imagine, we all know how Mickey Mouse looks like, right? Or the head of the Mickey Mouse looks like, right? There's kind of one big circle, and that's the face, and then we got like two other black circles at the top of that one big circle, which is kind of two ears. Now imagine that Mickey Mouse had a nuclear incident in Chernobyl, and mutated. Instead of two ears, he's got four ears. So you've got one big circle in the middle, and you've got four kind of smaller circles at the top of that one big one. So the mutated Mickey Mouse. Well, that's basically my way to graphically show what human nature is. The big circle is evolution, everything that we've inherited as part of our biological and social evolution over hundreds of thousands of years, and millions of years in some instances as well. So basically, these things are hardwired into our brains, and our minds are in big parts actually driven by the evolutionary aspects of simply who we are and as a species, how we've evolved. Now, the four ears on top of that is the social structures that we've got. The first one is, I put all of those into the same basket because they are almost indistinguishable in this way, political economical sphere. The political system and the economical system, they're very often sort of supporting each other. I put religion into that one as well, because in my experience, there's one binary option, only two kind of things that we can have with religion. Either it's part of the system, it is so kind of embedded into the system that is also inseparable from the particularly political system, or it's completely irrelevant. Like in the UK, religion really doesn't play almost any role, almost, not completely, but almost any role in everyday life and many kind of other things that are happening around us. It's quite different in America, for example, quite different in Serbia as well. So that's the first ear. The second one is the educational system. Everything up from kind of very, very early age, particularly primary education and the secondary education, and we've got universities as well. In what ways is the educational system is preparing us to face the realities of ourselves and the realities of the world around us, and also supporting or attenuating the political, economic, and religious aspects of one society. Some of the education environments are actually actively trying to reduce the impact of those. Some of them are part of the system, are actually through the politicized educational programs, actually pushing political and religious narratives as well. The third ear would be the family, or I may actually leave the family for the last. The third one would be the media sphere. In what ways is the whole of the media system, again, conveying reality to us, and in that particular way, actually shaping our understanding of what reality actually is, what is normal and what is not normal. And the fourth one is the family, of course, which is basically the fourth space where our attitudes to life formed in many ways, good or bad, for and against, and for the family, against the family, and various other dynamics that we know do exist in that space. So these four ears are sort of the social sphere that we've got around our individual and collective evolutionary aspects. And for me, that's actually the image that describes what we call the human nature, because we're going to be behaving always as a combination of our evolutionary traits and the social systems that are playing around us, that we are part of. And always the interaction between these two complexes is actually what we may call human nature. So I'm not just referring to the biological kind of side of that. So that frames what I'm trying to say tonight, and tonight for me, sorry, this afternoon. So what are the 6 literacies then that I've noticed we are lacking in order to cope with the modern world and all the changes that are happening? When unusually, and some of them may surprise you, I haven't seen lots of people framing it that way. But for me, probably the first one, and maybe even the most important one, is the storytelling literacy, or how I call it, the archetypal narrative literacy. And what's archetypal narrative literacy? Well, simply put, stories are one of the most, probably the most technology that we've ever created as a species. And I treat narratives and storytelling as a technology. Why? Simply because even when you go back to the old Greeks, they actually called the art techne, which means skill of actually making something. So for them, there was kind of the technological aspect in creating art as well. Simply because it's a technology that we as a species have developed in order to survive on this planet and in order to cope with all the challenges that we have, meaning having only one offspring every 9 months, if we are lucky for that offspring to survive at all, which means differently from many other species, almost all the other species, we do not produce a huge number of offsprings and just leave it to the mother nature for some of them to survive and continue the species. Some of them sadly die. We don't have that luxury. So we had to develop, at the moment the language has developed as an ability of our species, immediately one of the first kind of uses of language was actually to convey meaning and training to the offspring, to try to prepare them to the challenges of life without the trial and error. Because, you know, when you actually try to find out whether a lion is a dangerous thing or not by a trial and error, not a lot of us would have survived on the face of this planet. So stories we use, narratives we use to actually teach us about the world, and they still do that. And what we know through the history of the civilization is that, and lots of people were studying that, from Vladimir Prop in 1930s to Claude Lévi-Strauss, and most famously recent times, although that book was published in 1949, Joseph Campbell and his legendary book Hero with 1,000 Faces. What we actually did realize is that most of the archetypal stories, that the brain works on stories, the mind works on stories, that basically we don't have meaning without a narrative. It's impossible to conceive the concept of meaning something to somebody without a certain narrative that is going to actually frame that meaning. So our brains are simply wired to process, to work on stories, to work on narratives. That is the main clay, the matter with which, apart from the basic impulses coming from our senses, basically immediately the brain starts making narratives based on those impulses, saying, oh, to me it seems like this is this. 2, 3, 4, 5 things, impulses kind of put together, immediately I believe this is what is happening. So the brain is constantly creating
is making us vulnerable. Machine.
Exactly. At the same time, yeah, it's actually saving, of course, because we can't process everything, particularly consciously, everything that is coming into our brain. But so it's saving a lot of time. But on the other hand, if somebody, and this is one coming later on to the impulse literacy, which is the second one, if somebody knows how it works and starts gaming the mind, then basically it makes us vulnerable, because it can trigger various behaviors and attitudes and feelings just by knowing how that mechanism works. So archetypal narratives are actually all around us. We are completely and utterly immersed into it, and we're not even aware of it. And when I say archetypal narratives, what do I mean by that? Well, the archetypal structure of the story is what we call the dramatic narrative, the dramatic story. First of all, there's always one protagonist or the hero. Very often we are the hero of our story. And even cognitive sciences would tell us that what we call the personality is very often a narrative that we tell to ourselves. And one of the main jobs that the brain or the mind actually has is to keep us the hero of a particular narrative. That's why it's so difficult to admit that we are wrong, or we were wrong. That means that you literally have to stop believing that you were the hero of the story, that you are rightly right, and then you have to admit actually that you made a mistake. You're not a hero in that story anymore. That's really, really, really painful. It goes against kind of the very, very deep structures in the brain. So there's always a hero. That could be us, me, or that could be us. It could be a collective hero, which is a people, a religion, a tribe, any group of people that actually shares the same or the similar narrative. And there's always something that we are fighting against. Okay, it doesn't have to be the other people. Very often there's the others who are actually jeopardizing our ways of life, who want to kind of take our jobs. They want to take all the kind of other things that we've got. It could be other people, but sometimes that could be situations, that could be nature. Usually there is some sort of an impediment to the hero's desires, our own desires, either through people or the situations. And we are fighting that. And dramatic narratives, there is a conflict. the conflict that the hero is fighting the bad things, the bad influence, the bad guys. And in that particular conflict, we are always kind of hoping that we are going to be the ones to win, and then we are going to be the ones to be transformed in a positive way from this state, the problematic state here, to a better state in the future. Whether that's feeling more secure, like many of the populists are doing with us now, feeling more secure, or whether somebody's promising a better future, like the early working internationals or the working movements and the union movements were actually promising a better future in the future for the working class. It's not a narrative that is kind of very strong anymore. Now we have gone back to the security narrative much more, the intimacy of the local group that is going to kind of get together and defend itself from the outside influences and even the outsiders. It's a very simple, incredibly powerful narrative, and that's what we call the archetypal narrative. And we are swamped in it, completely immersed in it almost every single moment of our lives. And not just that we are swamped in it because it's a very natural kind of human thing, but it's stimulated as well. And it's stimulated in a very organized ways. If you look at actually the training that we get for archetypal thinking, the whole of the Hollywood is training us for many, many decades in archetypal thinking, because that's the basis of all of their stories, right? We are taught about that through the political system, particularly in democracy, where basically the elections are nothing else than fights, us against them, us against somebody else who thinks differently. So it's everywhere, it's all around us. But you know, what else is happening? It's happening that the archetypal storytelling is a very profitable thing as well. Because when you understand that people work on archetypal narratives and you learn how to do it, like my ex-job, then you realize you can make a lot of money. So my problem today is that nobody's teaching us from the very early age how archetypal narratives work and what to do about it, how to defend ourselves from them. Every single time when I was in a situation to talk about archetypal narratives with somebody, give or take maybe a few NGOs, it was always from the functional point of view, how to understand it better so I can make more money, so I can sell my things better, so I can develop my company's brand better, so that I can use it, let me put it this way, against the people in order to get personal or commercial advantage. But nobody's teaching us how to defend ourselves from the archetypal narratives, how to reduce their power over us. You know, in Harry Potter books, you've got something called the defense from the dark arts. And this is literally what it is, or what it should be. In schools, we should have archetypal literacy as one of the kind of key defenses from the dark arts, and we are not having this, or not in any organized way that I've seen so far. So for me, this is one of the kind of key big things, because we completely are oblivious to it. And we are just kind of, because when I come to the impulses, because it's completely inextricably connected, the archetypal narratives are used to stimulate our various impulses and various emotions. And what is happening is basically that you've got, on one side, it's a asymmetrical warfare happening now. On one side, you've got a super organized, scientifically supported political and commercial system that is designed and is constantly, in a very rational way, scientifically working in triggering various impulses through the archetypal narratives, talking about the population overall. While on the other side, you've got a poor consumer who is struggling to be a citizen, but you've got a poor consumer who simply doesn't know what is going on, because you are feeling pulled in all sorts of different directions very compellingly, because those narratives are designed from the moment one to actually trigger various impulses that we've got in ourselves. And that's a bit of a problem, or actually, I'm being very English here, but actually it's a big problem that we got, simply because we are so much immersed into it, we are not aware of what is going on, and this is a big part of our problem, simply because we have built a civilization that has started destroying the rational faculties that we've got. We are being trained for many, many decades to behave on impulses more than kind of anything else. And this is the second literacy that we need, the impulse literacy. Because we live in a very impulsive society, we have been for many decades now, where in the middle of a storm of, and again, through the political and commercial, I'm not saying it's a conspiracy, it's just a conspiracy of interest, meaning that it works and makes a lot of money to a lot of people, millions of people, and naturally you got the focus actually to kind of keep doing those kind of things and doing those things to us. So I'm not saying it's a conscious conspiracy, but basically that system is constantly stimulating our impulses. Think from the very, very early age, we are bombarded with millions of messages who are actually the main aim and the only aim of those narratives is to trigger various impulses in our minds and actually manifest itself through our desired behavior, which means that we would like to, first of all, to get the attention, because attention is a very scarce resource. The second one, when they get the attention, then to actually impart some of the narratives and stimulate some of the impulses in our minds in order to get the desired behavior of spending time on somewhere, on something, and then giving our data, giving the reactions first and foremost, through the reactions revealing the data, and eventually using all that knowledge in order to extract some commercial benefit, usually commercial or political benefit from it. So impulses are an incredibly important thing because again, we now know we are really not a hugely rational beings. We simply do know that quite well. In the last 30 years, I very often controversially say cognitive sciences have taught us about human nature more than any philosophy in 3,500 years, because philosophy didn't have a scientific apparatus very, very often, and it was just observation. I mean, somebody says, I think that the world works in this particular way. I feel that people behave in this particular way. But now we sort of know, we really do know scientifically. And we are not very, very rational. And that's why Daniel Kahneman got the Nobel Prize. The whole thing about cognitive biases and how the cognitive biases are being triggered in economy, in politics, in real life, in our interactions between ourselves is incredibly revealing things. So if you haven't read his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, and his latest book, The Noise, I strongly suggest that you do it, because that's going to tell you and explain human nature much better to everybody than almost anything before that. So the cognitive biases are that evolutionary bit that is hardwired very often into our brains, socially and biologically as well. Some of those are more biologically based, some of them are much more socially based as part of our social evolution. And we are not trained in biases. I don't know of a school program, at least in countries that I lived in, that actually has biases as part of the school program. We may call it emotional literacy, and we know Daniel Goleman and many kind of others are talking about emotional literacy. But actually, we do not. I don't know, probably it's different in America, maybe some cities and maybe some schools, and maybe you do know about some of those. But overall, it's quite paltry. It's not a lot, given how many of us there are, how many schools we've got in developed countries. Non-existent to very, 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 very small number of schools doing anything about it. And again, it is part of us. It can't be more important. We don't have a training about that. How to try to mitigate our biases. It's quite difficult actually to do it on your own. It's not impossible to do something about some of them, but they're so deeply ingrained that we are very often not even aware of them. And the only thing that you need actually to try to mitigate that is to have a group of people around you who are also bias literate, and who you have trust with. And then actually as part of that group, they can actually try to kind of keep you on a straight and narrow road. So that's kind of another big literacy that I think we need and we are lacking. And it's a sad story simply because our civilization is the impulsive civilization. We are constantly bombarded, we are trained, we don't have a choice because lots of businesses have to make money, and they make money by triggering impulses. And that's what we call neoliberal capitalism, or if you want that word, if you don't like that word, any sort of a system that is actually based on commercial interest, and there's a freedom of speech, and also there's freedom of advertising, and the freedom of manipulation as well, because the regulations are pretty lax, particularly in America, Even in Europe, only certain things are regulated, but some of the most important things are not, for example. So that's kind of the second literacy, the impulse literacy. And the archetypal narratives and the impulses are, again, completely, almost inseparable, because without the archetypal narratives, many of our impulses, and with the commercial and political interest, of course, behind it, they haven't been triggered at all. They may have been triggered in our everyday communications, everyday interactions, but on a mass systematic level, it would be much, much less of that. The third one is then again connected to it, is the attention literacy or illiteracy. I think that one of the biggest epidemics that we've got, much bigger than Corona, is the attention illiteracy epidemics. We are simply not very knowledgeable about how to use a very scarce resource that is our attention. And we know that attention is a sort of a narrow pipe through which not a lot of things can actually go at the same time, simultaneously. And you know the effect. You are deeply immersed into a conversation with a friend and you're walking down the street. And as the conversation heats up and the argument becomes stronger, not quarreling, simply that you get immersed into a conversation much more, we start slowing down. We even start walking more slowly. And that's the brain simply not being able to cope with both of those operations, moving your legs and actually having a strong, complex cognitive argument working at the same time. Simply, it's a narrow pipe. And what we do with that narrow pipe during our waking hours, well, we are forced to spend a big part of that onto the professional duties, i.e. work, right? And then the second one is whatever's left for friends, family, and kind of any other things. And there's not a lot of other things that can go through that pipe at the same time. That's why it's so incredibly important to have all these meditation, mindfulness, and other exercises to try to actually reduce the pressure, the cognitive load onto our attention. But because we've got archetypal narratives and because we've got impulse stimulations, our attention is being stretched and pulled in so many different ways at the same time as well, every single waking moment of our lives. And that means that our attention is being dissipated. It means that it's being, well, I'm going to use the word wasted, but very often it is, because it's simply that time that we've got during the day and that attention that we've got during the day simply got a little bit wasted. We are lost in that story. Our own imagination is very often lost in that story, but we as human beings are lost in that story. Reflection and reflexivity is being lost in that story. And many kind of other, I would say, more constructive things individually and socially are being lost in that story as well. And what is not helping is the algorithms, for example, who are kind of hitting us from the other side, because the algorithms are one of the kind of main drains on our attention as well. So you've got the media sphere, you've got the work, of course, you've got the media sphere that is drawing lots of our attention, and then we've got the algos who are actually trying to keep them into their definition of what is important for us, i.e. what our algorithms doing for us is trying to map out our different landscape, our different attentional landscape, basically, and try to keep us within that attentional landscape that is more constructive very often for whoever is controlling a particular algorithm. Not necessarily for us, but certainly for somebody who's controlling the algorithm. Because if you got people's attention, you got people's energy. Energy follows attention. Or how Google guys used to say, money follows attention. And we know that in the modern world, it's one of kind of the most priceless commodities that we can get, our personal data, because the personal data has the ultimate goal. Personal data is used for targeting, for better profiling, for better targeting, for commercial purposes. But the ultimate result of that is to become better at getting our attention. And if I get your attention, I can start monetizing that attention. And why is that difficult? Simply because there's so many things fighting for our attention every single moment, every single day. So attention literacy or attention illiteracy is, for me, and it really is an epidemic, is one of the kind of key problems that we've got today. And again, stimulated by archetypal narratives and the impulse tornado kind of happening around us and inside us. So that will become the third one. The fourth one for me is the statistical literacy. And it's not the same as numerical literacy. It's a different one. It's not just about knowing basic mathematical or even more advanced mathematical operations. It's actually being able to understand the statistical concepts in real life and how to interpret real life things happening around us through some of the basic, predominantly statistical concepts. There's three things here that I believe in everyday life could be the most useful to people if we are trained in that. First of all is the difference between average and typical, or mean, or median. And you can use kind of any of those almost interchangeably, but average is one of kind of biggest culprits in the modern world. As you know, there's so many many of you are mathematicians, are kind of work in similar areas that kind of involve lots of statistics and mathematics. As Professor Todd Rose, in one of his amazing books called The End of Average, really clearly has described, he's basically at Princeton, if I'm not mistaken at the moment, Harvard or Princeton, I think it's Princeton. And basically average doesn't work on an individual level. It only works on a collective group level, but individually average doesn't exist. If you try to gauge a particular one single person through the lens of average, usually goes very, very wrong. So, but look at our educational systems, what they're based on. Our educational systems are based on averages. The key objective is to be in the region of the average, just a little bit better, right? That's the definition of success in education. Somewhere in the region of average, but a bit better than that. If you are hugely better, then in Britain, for example, you are treated as a person with special needs, special educational needs. And you do have special educational needs, not just in the way how it's usually described, right? That you can't achieve. You are actually so overachieving, but the system will not let you skip two grades, 2 years. Or the system is not going to give you any other support because you are absolutely, utterly bored with the regular program. What else can they offer you? And very often not much, because the whole system was based on average. And that's kind of one of the big problems. But also in practice, if you have a situation like this, president of one country says, oh, the average salary in our country is 450 euros. But the typical salary, which means what the most people receive, is about 250 euros. Which picture is more correct? Or the better description of the reality around us? Because the average is skewed or heightened by having a lot of really, really, really rich people around us as well. And then when you kind of put them into a pot, because they're so hugely much richer than everybody else, then basically your average is going to go up. But it's not a good depiction of reality, because it's much more realistic to kind of think that people live with 150 euros a month. So that's kind of, for me, one of the first things, not knowing the difference between the average and the typical. The second one is the base. When we actually processing any news, any information that is actually saying how successful something is going on, how something is improving and so on, we always have to, as you know, ask the question, and from which particular base, and what are the trends as well. So if the base is really, really, really low, like post-World War II countries, particularly communist countries, who are actually moving on from a pre-industrial societies into industrial societies, their annual rates of growth, economical growth, were absolutely spectacular, right? And they had the reason to boast against the Western countries, look, how much faster are we developing? So yeah, but your base was really, really low. Today, lots of politicians actually use that particular trick to show us how things are improving, conveniently forgetting that they're actually starting with a very, very low base, usually that, or some kind of other statistical artifacts are missing in it in order to actually show that the story is not exactly what it is. And the third one, probably the most difficult for the human minds to grasp, is probability. How probability actually works in reality, because we, again, have the narrative version of the probability, and always kind of expect things that our mind is telling us that we should be expecting through the kind of other areas of human life, which are not based on mathematical probability at all. So we create those narratives. You know that story, yeah, the occult, the magical thinking very often works on the notion of probability. You know what the story writer called 2 + 2 = 5. when you basically connect 2 and 2 and actually get a bigger picture, then those 2 and 2 actually present in its own right. Usually in sports, basketball, you've got somebody who is really suddenly got kind of 3 nets in a row, and everybody starts talking, oh, he's on a roll now, this is his night, or whatever. Well, statistically, probability is that you may hit 10 nets in a row, and it doesn't mean that you just had a kind of a great game. It means that probability, laws of probability are saying sometimes that's going to happen, and it happened that particular moment. And then the next 3 matches, that particular person is completely or pretty useless, or maybe not useless, but not performing on the same level, simply because it's varying from the personal and biological and physiological point of view as well, and psychological. So probability, we are really bad at imagining what is probable. We are simply not trained, and our brain has not evolved in actually really well predicting or actually putting things together and start predicting what's going to happen. So that's kind of another training, the third statistical training that I believe is absolutely critical for us, because it may help us avoid some false hopes, but also it may help us get more hope from situations that actually look completely hopeless, and balance our points of view this way and the other way as well. So that would be kind of the fourth literacy. The fifth would be the team literacy. And why is that now important? Well, again, we are, on one hand, we are tribal as a species. We have evolved to be part of a group, and we have evolved through a group. So there's an interesting paradoxical tendency in our minds. On one hand, most of us, give or take a few strong introverts like myself, who are not particularly perturbed by that, but most of us actually would like to belong to a part of a group and be immersed in it. But on the other hand, we want to dominate the group. We also kind of, status is a very important thing, and also evolutionary very important thing, because the higher status you've got, more chances of getting a better food and getting better mating partners. So basically, that's a really, really important thing. So I want to dominate the group. I would like to become the alpha as well. And then you've got that paradoxical tendency that we are fighting the group us at the same time that we actually want to be part of the group. And it's even more important for 2 reasons for the so-called fourth industrial revolution, or the post-industrial society. In that kind of a society, we know that a lot of the learning is going to be done personally, which means that the educational system is simply not following, and they are not going to follow for quite some time, to actually try to really educate us in many ways along the lines of what I was talking about, educate us in this particular way, preparing us for this new world. And that means that a lot of learning has to happen on our own. We have to be able to educate ourselves a lot every single day. But it's very difficult to do that if your attention is completely scattered. If we are suffering the attention illiteracy, we simply cannot organize ourselves personally to be focused on one subject for a long period of time. And we actually need help from other people. But if I'm not ready to accept help, and also if I want to work in a professional environment today, very often I cannot completely work on my own. I'm always part of a team, or I am leading a team. Many of the even scientific discoveries, look at the vaccines, it's not the work of one person. It's the work of teams of people working diligently in a very coordinated way for some time in order to produce this particular breakthrough, or even this particular product. So if we don't know how to function as part of the team, we're simply going to have a problem. Big part of not being able to function as part of the team is the hyper-individualistic culture that is always telling us that we can satisfy every single impulse we've got every single moment of our waking lives. And that's the first thing. We always come first, and we are trained to think of ourselves as always coming first. Well, now in a team, there's other people who actually have the same or similar feelings. So what are we going to do about that? And we simply cannot both learn and develop, and be part of the constructive team in any sort of a business or educational environment without being a constructive member of the team or a team leader as well. And that requires training. That requires requires training in empathy, requires training in understanding the other side, stepping into their shoes, moving away from our biases, from our impulses, and actually being able to understand the point of view of another person. That training is just not happening a lot. Actually, the Western countries, and particularly the Scandinavian, Anglo-Saxons, are much better at that than, let's say, in the Balkans, where in schools and in various other environments, the teamwork is stimulated from the very early age. We really don't have a lot of that over here yet, but it's absolutely critical. But there's another point in the teamwork. Well, think about this. Professor Todd Rose also spoke about it in his book. It's called the jagged profile, and some of you, or the spiky profile, some of you may have been maybe aware of that, may even use it. So what's the jagged or the spiky profile? Well, each of us, first of all, we're not the same on the individual level, and that sounds like such a trite thing to say, but actually, yeah, all the cliches are just often repeated truths, right? So we are not the same on the individual level, which means we have some talents and some other kind of sides of our skill sets or even personalities are not as well developed or not as strong. And we can't be strong at everything, so simply we cannot. So we have to understand actually what is our spiky profile. Where am I strong, and what are the kind of part of the things that I'm not really strong at? But that's contextual. Those things matter only within certain contexts. So for example, if I want to get a job in a particular company, like myself, I was getting a job at Google, and I need to kind of really fit within a particular team. Well, the first thing that I need to know is what is the jagged profile of the position that I apply for, I should be working in. Which means that the description of the position should be, okay, that person has to be really strong in these kind of things. These things are nice to have, not critical, and these things are absolutely not important. And just when we have that spiky profile, we try to find a person that's really going to kind of to match that particular profile. But without knowing the profile of the position or of the team, we're not going to know what kind of person we actually need. And it's a guessing process. What do I mean by that? Think about the concept of communications. You know, you've heard the phrase, oh, the person has to be a really good communicator. What does that mean? What kind of communication is really required for that particular context, for that particular position? You can't have everything. Is that person really good at presenting in front of 100 people, particularly senior people? Is that person absolutely petrified of ever doing that, but is brilliant at one-to-one communication with the members of the team? Is that person maybe not so brilliant within the members of the team, but absolutely fantastic at talking to people underneath her or him? So managing downward, or actually really good at managing upward, or building side relationships with other teams in the company. What kind of communication do we really need for this particular context? And without knowing precisely that, we would never actually be able to answer the question, which particular communication skills we need for this situation. So many companies do not think about it, just good communicator, whatever. It doesn't work like that in practice, really. So the jagged profile allows me to then understand myself and to understand the job position I'm going into and to understand the environment I'm working within. And that allows me to really kind of fit within the particular team much, much better. It is possible to align the dynamics. It is possible to, let me put it this way, make a more successful team. But it's not perfect and it doesn't work always. You always have to start with at least some kind of things that are working in synchronization and in synergy as well. So team literacy is a phenomenal thing, and again starts with understanding my own jagged profiles in different contexts. Context as what's my jagged profile as a parent, as a professional, as a friend, as a lover, and kind of many other roles and contexts that we are participating in. And the sixth literacy will be the creative literacy. And again, we're talking a lot about it, but actually very few people really sit to think about what creativity actually is. So you say, oh, we need more creative literacy, creative training. Creativity is not training. It's an attitude, and it's a point of view, and it's behavior. Creativity is behavior. Creativity is not that you are brainstorming. Creativity is, first of all, a permission within a company to rock the boat, to challenge status quo, to simply do things differently or think differently. Creativity is a political act, if you ask me. So if you don't have the environment that is actually stimulating people to behave and think this and feel in these particular ways, forget about hackathons. I mean, yes, I've run dozens of them, but you can clearly see, literally within 10 minutes, you can actually see that from the cultural point of view, which company actually stimulates creativity, which company is just talking about. Literally within 10 minutes, it's becoming very, very clear. So creativity has to be stimulated and developed from the very early age as well, which means that in schools, even in nurseries, we have to start encouraging different points of view, encouraging different ways of doing things within the constraints of being not hurting anybody else and not hugely damaging the environment around us. I do agree with that. But within that, within those kind of constraints, just do not agree with me. And particularly in schools, particularly in some parts of the world, I'm sitting in that part of the world, one of those parts of the world at the moment. Any sort of disagreement, any sort of different opinion is really frowned upon. In schools, kids are taught to listen, to obey, not to be creative, literally to obey. And we look at official research for Serbia, school kids, particularly primary school kids in Serbia, amongst the European countries, index incredibly highly, some of the highest countries in Europe on obedience and obedience to the authority, and some of the lowest scores on creativity, which is absolutely devastating because outside of the school, we tend to be quite unusually creative people, but the system is completely trying to kill that for various particularly political reasons. So creativity means that we have to tolerate diversity, and that doesn't just mean gender diversity nor even racial diversity. It means neurocognitive diversity, people who simply perceive the world in completely different shades and colors and shapes, people who may be Asperger's but have absolutely brilliant conceptualizations of the problem space that we are working in trying to resolve it. That's one of the reasons that at Google, for example, about 40% of their engineers are on the autistic spectrum. And they are deliberately recruited with that kind of a neurodiverse mind, because if you want to think outside of the box, you have to be outside of the box. You can't think outside of the box within the box. It's much more difficult to do it that way. And these brains, those kinds of brains, are brought in order to stimulate creative points of view and creative discourses that we can deploy. And also, when I say creativity, many people say, many cognitive scientists will say that creativity is nothing else than the hyper association, the ability, the skill, and the ability to hyper associate, which means that your association map is hugely wide. And you've got people, individual people with those skills that can connect A and not B, but A and Z over there, or Z, let's use the American expression, right? A and Z over there. And nobody else would think about the Z at a time. They may kind of go all the way up to F, but that's where everybody stops. But they go all the way to Z. And that happens in one person. And there are people like that we have to accept and kind of make part of the team or our environment. But sometimes, and I know that myself, more often than not, you got a much wider association map if you get different people around the table, or you have different people around you all the time. But you have to allow them the space to be different. There's no creativity training without neurodiversity and any other diversity training as well. And this is kind of another literacy that is hugely important for us, because creativity is very often called the last resort that we as a species actually have. You may think in our joint historical past, there were many situations where we had very few resources, for example, but creativity sort of sorted that out. We had various crises, but creativity managed to find a solution. Think about the Malthus and the food and the population crisis, predicted population crisis, that didn't materialize. Why? Because our creativity allowed them to produce much, much more food than was ever thought or deemed conceivable. And that's why we don't mind, from the point of view of the food, how many people on planet we have at the moment. So creativity is the ultimate resource. It may actually help us resolve many or almost all of the other problems that we've got, but it's not going to help. It's not going to happen if we stimulate just groupthink, and if we start reducing and not training ourselves for creativity from the very, very early age. So in a nutshell, for me, these 6 things are some of the reasons why things are falling apart around us, because we are killing some of those literacies. And also, if we don't know that there are literacies, that are the skill sets that we need to develop from very early age and keep developing most of our lives, then we are not really in a position to help a lot. Why do I think that is happening? Well, this Canadian philosopher, Professor Joseph Heath, whose book Enlightenment 2.0 I strongly recommend as well. It really explains in a very good language and not very heavy reading at all. Again, what is happening? He predicted many things, actually, what are happening today. And he has a very memorable and very a true phrase that he used. And that phrase is that there is a reason that civilizations collapse into barbarity and not the other way around. We have never collapsed into civilization from barbarity. We have had to build it incredibly slowly and painstakingly until we reach certain levels. But as you know that in America, I know that in UK, we know that from Serbia as well. Within a few years, things can really be dismantled quite quickly, which means, and that's exactly what is happening in the modern world. The combination of political and economical narratives, stories that we may call ideologies, different ideological approaches, religious approaches, and so on and so forth. All of these things are basically dismantling that scaffolding that we call civilization around us. We are trained to perceive the world through archetypal stories, black and white, us versus them. Our emotional impulses are triggered all the time, and we're completely lost in pursuing those impulses instead of actually having a bigger, wider, deeper perspective and more self-reflection. We are not very literate in allocating our attention. We are not very literate with numbers and how the numbers are manipulated in order to give us the distorted picture of the reality. We are not really trained, well, you in the States are better than many other parts of the world, in the teamwork, and creativity is under attack from every possible angle. The saddest of all, in the school part of the spectrum of the human nature, in the school environment, because we are almost deliberately, feels like deliberately trying to kill all the creativity that we are imbued with from the very early age. How do we know that? Well, NASA, several years ago, and this is the last thing I'm going to say on my side, and then we can open up for chatting. NASA did a fantastic research. 1,600 children in America at age 4 or 5, I believe. The first research, and they've used the questionnaire and the methodology developed for the scientists actually to gauge they call it the genius quotient of the scientists. The most creative, the most unusual, the most, well, creativity is basically the word, brains that they can detect. And they've then applied exactly the same methodology onto children just to see what's going on. About more than 90% of the kids, those 1,600 kids at the age of 4 or 5, more than 90% actually scored on the genius level. 4 years after that, only 30% scored that way. When they were 15 and the same research was applied, so it was a longitudinal research, only 12% reached that level, which means that the educational system is almost deliberately knocking out every living thing out of our creative faculties and capabilities, which is actually tragic. It means that we are defeating a human nature and defeating the best tool that we've got to overcome almost anything that can come our way. So that's why I think these 6 literacies are absolutely critical things. And thank you very much for listening to me, and thank you very much for the opportunity to actually say that and share that with you. Any questions, any comments that you may have, any challenges that you may have to this, absolutely welcome, please.
Thank you very much on behalf of everyone, and I invite everyone to post a question on the chat. Yeah, I have someone here someone, let me see who that is. I think it's maybe Marko Divac, but I'm not sure. It's an applause here for Lazar, who is the author of the book Jagged Spiky Profile.
It's Professor Todd Rose, Toddrose, Todd Rose. Strongly recommend that book together with Professor Joseph Heath's Enlightenment 2.0.
Okay,
and,
so
sorry, and Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow as well.
I hope we were all taking notes. But I do have a question. Maybe it's more of an elaboration on what you just told us. So I see many of those types of literacy that you just mentioned as sort of supported by the technologies and technological ecosystem that we live in. And as a technical person, I'm not supporting any of technological aspects or education or like recruiting someone for those professions. I just want to say that my own observation is that there should be some sort of education teaching people the practical aspects of the technologies involved. Not only those changes that you enumerated quite well that were brought about by the technologies, but how essentially those technologies work so that we don't fall into the traps that the technology actually enables. Of course, not every technological use is mean or has some bad intentions, but even those good ones should be somehow explained, because you know, we live in an era where we are going from connected persons, which was this time that we live, into connected machines, which is this new 5G development, into connected intelligence. And now with all the data that's being collected from us and all the our behaviors that have been profiled over the years, can you imagine what connected intelligence can do with all that data? So I think there should be some very convenient, very down-to-earth approach, even cartoonish approach, to explain that ecosystem, how the computer networks work, how the wireless communication works, what is that 5G, and what are those numerically assigned concepts, like even the fourth industrial revolution. Are we going to continue enumerating by numbers, or explain to people, you know, find a way to pictorially describe what is going on? So I would add to your set of necessary literacies, I would add this need to explain the practical ways how a technology works.
There's so many things actually that you packed into the comment that we can really kind of talk about. Literally, there's kind of 3 or 4 really important things. Well, let me kind of start with that functional kind of thing about the way to present anything to the audiences, which I used to do kind of for decades. There's absolutely, my deep experiences, there are absolutely no boring concepts under the sun. No boring companies, no boring products, no boring services. Nothing is boring, just boring ways to talk about it. If you look at history, how we talk about history, it's one of the most boring subjects in schools, but then Epic Rap Battles of History channel on YouTube has about 20 million subscribers globally. And the thing that they talk about is historical personalities, just through the medium of rap battles. That means it's formatted for the audiences, the publics that they want to actually reach. There's just nothing cannot be told in an engaging way if you know your audience, if you know the ways how they communicate and the formats that they prefer, and everything would be packaged in a good way to be really accessible, easy, understandable, and even motivating for them. Because again, if you deploy archetypal narratives that we do deploy all the time, you can make it hugely stimulating and appealing for them to spend their time in that space as well. It's just that it's not being done in our official educational spaces, right? You'll find it on YouTube, but you have to find it on YouTube. You have to go there on YouTube. YouTube is not given to you. You have to actively search for it. Many people don't. So if we are exposed to some of those things, it will be easier. The second thing is, maybe the second aspect that you've unpicked and mentioned there is, well, one of the biggest stories that we've got in the modern society is the story about the power of technology. Undoubtedly, it's a very powerful force. But I think it's even perceived as even more powerful because we have the narrative of presenting technology as being the most powerful force today, or maybe the only force that we've got today. So again, we're going back to the narratives, going back to the stories. One of the most important stories and strongest stories today is the story about the power of technology, right? And the third thing, so again, are we supporting that or not? How do we support that in everyday life? In those spheres, calling political, economical system, I think it's really good kind of supported in that part. How is it supported in the educational sphere? Maybe not so much. How is it supported in media? So-so. How is it supported in the family? Even more so-so. So I think that these are the bits that are lacking.
If I may interrupt you here, what is primarily important is to find the terminology, the words for all those things that are coming up our way. And we don't, we should, to be able to engage in that conversation, whether we want that technological innovation or not, and how to regulate it, we have to name them.
Exactly. Well, that's exactly the third point I was about to make. None of those things are agnostic, ethically and socially, and impact agnostic. All of those technologies do provide a certain impact, and we need an informed and again more rational debate about whether we think what we think would be the good sides of it and the bad sides of it. Something we never had, for example, with social media. Just take that particular example. And going back to the point that you made, well, language is a very important thing, as Wittgenstein even said, the limits, the boundaries of my language are the boundaries of my will, right? I simply cannot even comprehend things for which you don't have the words to kind of try to encapsulate it. But for me, the most important thing that you, in your comment, was the connecting of intelligences. And we know that new, huge and growing trend of the so-called empathic technologies is actually going to be whatever happened in social media times 10 or times 100. The moment that the machines are actually able to recognize, to process our emotions, our mood states and emotional states, and actually do something about it and actually give us the content that the system actually think would be the right content for that particular mood state. That we have two scenarios. We've got the big brother scenario, we've got the lots of little brothers scenario, meaning lots of little brothers is systems that are helping me in lots of everyday situations because they can kind of read where I am, what I want, even how I feel. Like giving up smoking. I was working on that program in the UK for several years for the Department of Health, and we used more than 100 text messages to actually help people in the moment of crisis. And that moment of crisis, you had to say that you are in the moment of crisis. Now, smart chatbots with the empathic technology, I can actually now deduct from your emojis and even the language that you use to text your friends, whether you are actually in the state of anxiousness and crisis, and actually try to help you. But also it's an awful, absolutely astounding space for manipulation. We know, not just from the Frances Haugen documents about Facebook, I mean, frankly, everybody in the industry knew that for the last 15 years. It's nothing new for people who worked in the industry, that basically systems can and will manipulate you. We know that angry people click much more, angry people comment much more. All the engagement metrics that the analysts at the Wall Street and the commercial clients are looking at are actually going up. If people are in a permanent state of anger, emotional arousal, and similar, anxious as well. So it's in the commercial interest of the systems to keep us in that state for as long as possible. We know that anxious people buy more. We know that depressed people buy more. It's in the commercial interest of systems to keep us probably in that state as well. So that's what I'm saying. There's two sides of it, and these things are not falling out from the sky. We as people, we as a society are deciding whether to go this way or that way, to allow this, to not allow this. And without a really, really balanced, rational debate, getting out of the big archetypal narratives, we're not going to be able to do that.
Yes, I apologize. It's really not Sylvia. It's her husband, Predrag, but using her computer. So in the for the disclosure, it's not Sylvia. Question about the pattern recognition, because I'm connected to the industry, and I know that marketings are not scattered efforts, but it's something called a marketing campaign. And with regards to the literacies and the recognition of when somebody is being manipulated or used within the context, I put a question in chat. Imagine I'm an evil villain from a Bond movie and I want to control the world. I'll present how I would do the marketing campaign and you tell me if this is how it's done optimally. I would use the second illiteracy or impulse control in order to instill fear or joy or hope in order to gather attention and keep attention there as long as I can until I manage to instill a narrative or a view of the world within somebody. And then in that particular case, I can even get rid of the impulse control and just have a narrative in order to propagate whatever the idea or direction I want people to move on. Would that be how things actually work and how we can recognize when we are being fed the narrative?
Well, I absolutely, that's it. And just with the caveat that we have to have some sort of access to the people. I'm not saying just through the media system, which would be the best, to have the control of the media, which many of the political system actually do, or at least in a huge part. So that's the condition, actually, to have access to people, particularly credible access to people, media and messengers that they actually trust. Then basically this is the formula. The second condition is that people do have some sort of upset, that there is an emotional state in which they, because of which they actually feel vulnerable, whether that's fear, already existing insecurity. I have to work 3 jobs in order to survive. I really don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. I have a feeling that somebody is completely robbing me of my just place in the world, whatever that means. The moment that you've got anxieties and insecurities, it's very easy to turn insecurities, anxieties, the feeling of feeling insecure into fear and into kind of certain kinds of actions, certain kind of attitudes as well, provided that I've got access to those people, credible access to those people. That's why the media sphere is incredibly important today. It's not impossible to work outside of it, but it's really, really, really difficult to kind of work outside it. But you tell me, look around you, literally in America, and tell me how much of this formula do you see in real life?
Honestly, I see a lot.
Yeah.
And that is actually kind of a little bit scary. I'm not talking just the marketing. There's also politics and everything else.
Exactly.
Maybe even primarily politics.
Exactly. And that's what what we call populism. It's nothing else than deploying archetypal narratives. Very, very old. And it's unbelievable how, and that's because we're not trained in it. On the contrary, we are trained, particularly through the advertising and marketing sphere, to actually start trusting archetypal narratives. That's why we are so we succumb so easily to them. And basically that's what populism actually means, that you use the archetypal narratives, usually based on fear, usually based on a state of insecurity, the state of anxiety about yourself, your position in the society, your life even. And actually it's incredibly easy to build on that if you got credible messages and start actually harnessing that particular insecurity and fear for various political or commercial purposes. It's not political, commercial, really there's no difference, just the objectives are different, but the mechanism is exactly the same. Look what's marketing industry doing to us. It's a constant stimulation of anxieties. Why? So that they can still keep selling, right? Imagine what's the worst thing for a capitalist system. It's not a satisfied customer. God forbid. The moment that we become satisfied, everything stops, right? It's the permanently dissatisfied customer who keeps buying.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, Milena. Ciao, Vito. Ciao, ciao.
As I'm a kind of a storyteller by my profession, a very interesting point that you said that kind of as human beings, we are prisoners of archetypical stories, right? Archetype type thing of stories, which is absolutely true, but they're so embedded in us. How can we gain literacy? Because starting with the Bible, right? Bible is very biased towards women, starting from Eve and further. And starting now that we are seeing this attempt to redefine stories, redefine Shakespeare, not do Othello because it insults our feeling of towards race, or not doing the Merchant of Venice because it's anti-Semitic, etc. Should we really retell these stories, wash them through interpretation, or how we teach that kind of literacy? Because we can't give up the archetypical stories. We can't forbid Cinderella, and it doesn't teach us very much, except that the shoe will save your life, right? It's kind of like Sex of the City of fairy tales about the shoes, right? And how we deal with that? Do we stay with the original, or we really, what do you think about that? Because we can't forbid all the archetypal tales that are embedded in time, in biases, basically, but also teach us a lot about humanity, right?
Yeah, it
what
does.
do we do? I mean, it's a big question for me.
Yeah, okay. So, and again, there's a lot of different questions in that one question, I would say. First of all, I believe that that whole debate would be much less important and much less emotionally charged if we are more emotionally literate to start with, and if we are more literate about archetypal narratives, simply because we would understand that those stories were created in an old world, in a different kind of societies, with completely different interpretations of what a productive society is all about, and the relations between people, and so on and so forth. Simply, we would process it differently because we are thinking and feeling differently, which we are still not, right? So that's, I believe, the first problem. The second one is that's nothing new, because we had the narrative adjustments all the time in the development of our civilizations. There was always some stories that were deemed, oh, this is not a story for us anymore. Let's kind of abandon it. Let's attenuate it. Let's reduce its presence in the collective conscience. Let's actually take up some other stories. You know, it happened during the communist times. Suddenly, certain stories became irrelevant and bourgeois, and some other stories became incredibly important. And we changed the narrative platforms that we've deployed. So let me put it this way. This is actually a relatively normal thing that is happening all the time. Now, what is the objective of teaching Shakespeare? Now, we may kind of go into more controversial kind of zones, right? Is it possible to teach somebody about the elements of human nature that he wrote about through other narratives? It is possible. But is it possible to do it in exactly the same language? That's not possible. So is it about the language, or is it about something else?
I think it's about the story, because look, Lazar, you can't perform Taming of the Shrew today. You can't. You absolutely can't. I mean, you have to interpret in other way, but how? I mean, and if we censor, if we say we can't perform Taming of the Shrew, we can't perform Othello, we can't perform.
I'm not for that. I'm not for that. I'm not for that.
Pouring ourselves from.
Well, again, it depends. It depends on who is the audience. You know, if I want to say, let's say that we got lots of negative stereotypes about, let's say, people of various ethnic origin, or lots of I won't use positive, negative, but constructive or destructive stereotypes, gender stereotypes, for example. for audiences that are not ready or able to distinguish them or to actually really recognize them, you need some sort of a warning, right? You would probably not going to do that a propaganda of that particular point of view without some sort of a warning. So if you're talking to audience who already understand those things, we don't need a warning really. But if you talk to audience who are not able to kind of distinguish those things, you would need some sort of a warning. So like with many other things in our past history and culture, there are things that come with a label now. They didn't have that label at the moment when those kind of things were created. But we still sell, you can still buy Mein Kampf, right?
But what you said, that we are creatures of, that we are formed through stories, through this archetypical
yes,
stories
we are.
that we both basically share, whether it's religion, mythology.
Well, we are. And here's why. We've got two psychological aspects or effects that are actually happening in our brain. One is the so-called mere exposure effect. The mere exposure effect is simply by being exposed to certain stimuli. If you are exposed to those stimuli on a regular basis, they become normal. So if you're constantly, I'll take Serbia as an example. If you're constantly exposed to the, let's say, gender stereotypes, or not stereotypes, actually awful gender.
I understand.
Trying to find the right word without offending anybody, but it's almost impossible. Simply, we know that it's quite a sexist. Very often, you'll find quite a lot of sexist behavior, and it's everywhere. It's in the politics, it's in the parliament, it's in the media, particularly in the media. It's everywhere around you. And you know, when you're exposed to it, you simply, a lot of the people simply do not think about it. It's just my environment. That means it's normal. I'm just exposed to it. So the mere exposure effect is going to create the effect whether we want it or not. So the question is actually how often are we exposed to this kind of content, and whether it has to be kind of attenuated, not banned. I'm not really about banning, but I am about labeling and warning. I am about that. For audiences that are not able to distinguish what is, what's the fact, what's fiction, and what is socially constructive or destructive, which is in its own right sort of a question, who is making that judgment, right? Now, hopefully science can help us a little bit more.
But can I ask a question that's related? Isn't the theater or many other forms of art, enjoying those forms of art, doesn't that require actually some intellectual, not the level, but matureness that allow us to maintain a distance and basically conceptualize the thematic that's addressed by that, and not take it so emotionally? We are actually trying to extract those messages and archetypal stories, the essence out of that, and not, we should try to not take every single thing literally and emotionally. So I guess particularly,
I guess sometimes yes, maybe sometimes not. For me, as an ex-propagandist, everything is about the context and the audience we are talking to, frankly. Usually, I always kind of try to distinguish who am I talking to. If you're talking to the regular theater-going audience, I don't really think we're going to have these problems, because they already know about the play, they know what the play is all about, and as you said, they're going to have some sort of cognitive faculties in order to be able actually to see the stereotypes and the negative stereotypes as well. But if you're doing it in a high school or in an elementary school, if you actually want to do Shakespeare and you take Othello or Taming of the Shrew or something else, without explaining to the kids actually what are the negative aspects of it as well, it will be a completely different feeling, because they already did it in a school play. If it's in a school play, it means it's good, it's all right. Why would a school then put it if it's not good? So unless there's a warning for those kind of audiences that these are the bits that are wrong, still you have a question. So if that's wrong, why are we doing it then? So it really depends.
No, I think it's a very important question. That's like, as you you say, literacy, understanding the archetypical stories that we are so that are so part now of our nature, of our society, and everything. Beginning, as I say, from the Bible, you know, like, or will we soon have to forbid Anna Karenina because it's kind of appropriation, because it's a man writing about a woman,
and it's stimulating suicidal thoughts.
Can I please join the conversation? I'm extremely enjoying this, and I'm very grateful for your provocations to allow us to think and say out loud what's on our mind. Unfortunately, I joined late. I thought it was going to be at 3 p.m. I'm a retired architect, but deeply involved and interested in early childhood education. And I'm very glad that you mentioned children and their creativity at a young age. I would just add a wonderful phrase of an early childhood educator who calls creativity a quality of thought. However, you are talking about programs in school and education in general as a way to prepare younger generations to participate in the world later on in life. I 100% agree with that, but I also believe that starts with very young children. Some scientists even believe that humans are endowed by evolution with so-called survival kit, an endowment which allow us from day one to encounter and interact with our world in ways that is allowing young children to view things from multiple perspectives.
Exactly.
So their neurons are many, endless. So their associations, as you say, and their ability to combine things, put things together are endless. The problem is really that as they progress through the process, we are just killing those very, very efficiently. So I would argue that one of the solutions is really focus on early childhood education to approach children with and help them nurture, cultivate, and further develop the abilities that are given at birth. And that is extreme urge and ability to learn, compassion. Young children are very sensitive to others around them, and they're open to other and otherness, not just humans, but just everything that's in their environment.
Even imaginary friends.
Exactly, they're imaginary. They're bugs are their friends, stones are their friends.
Exactly.
They are compassionate towards weeds. I can't stress enough the urgency to approach very young children, to cultivate the openness towards other, because we are faced and subjected to an assault by the dominant narratives, which claim to be the only truths, really completely eliminating our ability to think outside of the box. And everything that you mentioned, is so critical. And my question is always how to resist those, and what are the best course of actions. You may have said something earlier, but I
was referring to it. I have to say, I'm going to disappoint you. I'm a little bit pessimist about that, because that actually really strongly depends on two kind of parts of, those 4 Mickey Mouse ears at the top of our evolutionary traits. Depends on the educational system and on family. Educational system as we have today, even in developed countries, is actually created for the beginning of the 20th century to get mostly rural population to synchronize and train for working in factories. That's why we have the bell at the end of the class. It's conditioning for the factory work, basically. So that's not changing. That's one of the aspects of our lives that has least changed, despite all of the technological revolutions around us. Actually, the classroom has still kind of stayed more or less the same. And the second one is the family. And the family is, as you know, particularly in countries like America, under huge stress just to survive, let alone have time to be creative and creatively develop your children. So I'm I'm pretty pessimistic about that, I have to say.
Well, there are some programs, some approaches to early childhood education which are gaining ground, but unfortunately not enough to suppress.
That's my problem.
Yes,
we do have the intellectual apparatus. We do know what needs to be done.
Yeah.
But at the moment, it's not deployed even remotely enough.
Sure.
We have another raised hand as well. Anna, I think.
Yes, hi. Thank you very much. This was very engaging. So I will just stay in the vein of Milena's question. If you can elaborate on the loss of classic heroism in modern society and culture, and in the light of heroes and anti-heroes, like shifting ideals in the shifting culture, because we see, I mean, we all know that our kids play video games, and it's not just video games. There's tons and tons of anti-heroes, and this narrative, and what's a hero now, it's not hero of yesterday, So that would be my first question. And second question, I don't know if you have time to talk about that, is the loss of individual conscience.
I think
in the era of globalism, mass media.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. So just wanted to interrupt for a minute. In case we get cut short, interrupted by Zoom, just to be aware of that. We are not in control of that, but otherwise, if our speaker agrees, we can continue with questions.
I'm absolutely fine, and we can continue for as long as we want to. We just pray that Zoom is going to be merciful to us. So, Anna, just kind of the second part of your question, I think I've referred to it already. The system that we live in now, most of all people in America, I would say, but most of the, I'm using that word, I know it's a contentious word, neoliberal capitalism, but we know we have different kinds of capitalism, right? We got the more social democratic Scandinavian capitalism, we got the state capital, communist capitalism in China, we got the kleptocratic capitalism in Russia and Serbia. There's various forms of capitalism. So in the neoliberal one, so-called neoliberal one, I already mentioned that basically the system is made to actually take us from ourselves, or ourselves from us, whatever is the proper grammatical form. Meaning that the more reflectful you are, the worse customer and the worse consumer you become. And really, for me, in my mind, everything I've seen, it's almost like the binary equation that is happening there. I already kind of mentioned something, and I don't think that's going to change for as long as we live in a society or a system like this. But the first one, I have to ask you, just trying to understand the question properly so I can answer it the best I can. When you say the loss of classic heroism in modern society and culture in the light of heroes and anti-heroes, shifting ideals in a shifting culture, what exactly did you mean?
For example, you have Superman, popularity of Superman Superman is not as popular now as it was popular, well, I don't know, 20 years ago.
Yes, that's but Spider-Man is.
Okay, Spider-Man. But you have also, for example, if you know the series Money Heist, right?
Yeah.
Or, there are many examples from video games where anti-heroes. So
yeah.
People are like nowadays heroes, right?
Yes.
And so we are abandoning some, and you're talking about some archetypal, archetypes. Yeah. So we are abandoning in a way,
Well, maybe,
right?
Maybe I think we haven't, and here's why. I think archetypal patterns are still here, and we are completely immersed into them. I believe, what you may be referring to is the lack of the positive individual heroes.
Exactly.
Of the kind of Superman. We do have Spider-Man now. He's, as you know, it's very, very kind of current with the latest film. And I would say there may be kind of a few strong individual characters like the Black Panther for some communities, and kind of various other, even for females, kind of strong individual characters that we still see as the aspirational heroes. The second thing I've noticed, I haven't studied that space hugely, but the second thing that I've noticed is the slightly more kind of collective notion of heroism. I think that the Avengers are the reflection of that particular trend. Now you don't have to be, they're still kind of superheroes in their own right, but they now kind of learn how to work as a team. And I think that starting with the millennials and the younger generations, although many people say they lack empathy and they're completely focused and on themselves, actually, in my experience working with them and even having them in my team, actually they tend to be better team workers than some of the kind of older employees that I had in my team. Why? Because they are playing a lot of online connected games, and in their regular lives they're already part of teams, and most of their day is actually being part of a team that in a synchronized way is trying to achieve a particular goal within an online a network game. And I think that was an interesting training actually for them to be able to kind of slot within a team. At least that was my experience, and I do understand that Google is a pretty biased environment to actually draw any conclusions from in this case. So I think that we all have our own heroes, and what is it's a bit painful for me, it's the coolness of the negative characters. And this is something that I wanted to investigate a bit more. We've got Narcos, and we got lots of Peaky Blinders, and we've got kind of lots of black characters, and really, really nasty, there's no other word, nasty characters that not suddenly, but are becoming more and more cool. You've got video games in which actually lots of bad things are happening. There's almost not a positive character. Very popular video games in which you're doing lots of kind of bad things to other people around you. So I would say whether that's kind of psychological, some sort of a psychological valve through kind of which we get kind of lots of societal frustration and some of the pent-up aggression that we actually do it through it, or is actually normalization of that kind of behavior remains to be seen. This is a question for a social psychologist, and this is kind of above my pay grade, I would say. But I did notice some of those trends as well. Everybody always has some in a way, one person or several kind of people that we always kind of look up to, or actually we think they're cool. They're saying something about our attitudes, our points of view, our attitudes to the world, how we perceive the world around us and other people around us. It's very difficult to find an active person without that.
Please, everyone who wants to pose a question should unmute themselves.
So Isidora, yes, please.
I have sort of a comment question piggybacking off of Lela's previous comment. To me, it seems like all of these literacies are predicated on the sixth literacy, this idea that we need to break free of groupthink. And as you've said, that's sort of being encouraged or really forced upon us as early as primary school. So we need to break free of it in favor of individual critical thinking, and then sharing that individual critical thinking with others in discussion and agreement, and for that neurocognitive diversity. I know you said that you're sort of pessimistic about this kind of overturn in school systems. I think I am as well, but my question is, as there's clearly a strong interest in holding the populace to groupthink, how can we at a macro level, not at an individual level, overturn this? And at what level or what avenue really is, in your view, our best bet?
Frankly, in my experience, short of revolution, everything starts with the system, frankly. Either the system or such a hugely powerful, united front of the civil society, which usually requires many of the players in the civil society or the NGO sector to unite and have a kind of a fixed agenda around a particular issue and really push it for so many years that they actually force the system to start changing as well. But frankly, the system is always the best and the shortest way to change things in the society. If you change something in the political economical system, if that is then pushed to the people and start engaging people through the media system, if that is done through the educational system, that creeps into the family, into the workplace, into everywhere. And then basically that's how the quickest way to effect that change basically would be through the system. And that's why I'm pessimistic, because I don't see a lot of actually radical changes in the system. I hope that Corona could have been one of those kind of reset points for some parts of the system. But apart from the economic and a little bit of the remote education, I really did not spot any radical restructuring of the developed societies because of the Corona. So in the absence of the systematic approach, the only thing that we can do is try to do it individually as much as we can, predominantly in our own families, if we happen to have a family, and we actually can influence the family, or if we are surrounded by people who actually can help us effectuate that individual change. First of all, we need to understand exactly what is happening, what we can do about it, and actually start doing that, and then have the support of the immediate environment around us to kind of keep us on that path of the change. And then I firmly believe nobody should be standing alone against the system, that we start kind of joining the forces and start working together. I think that's one of the worst bits of the neoliberal paradigm that atomized us, broken us into individual pieces. And it's much easier to actually be overcome and to be manipulated when you're alone than if you're kind of part of a group with a strong kind of sense of direction.
Right.
Brilliant.
Also on the anti-hero note, I think one thing that sort of every anti-hero has is at least the possibility of redemption. And so I think maybe it's
well, that's exactly the archetypal narrative, that you have to have the transformation. Without the transformation, you don't have the cognitive satisfaction, right? That's why everybody has to change, right? Or if you're not ready to change, you have to die, right? That's what happens in archetypal narratives.
Yeah.
So, but maybe, maybe going now beyond the archetype, the appearance of teams of heroes is maybe just for the visual effect. We have to include the technology as well.
Well, we can avoid it. We simply cannot avoid it, but it became eye candy, right? And it's almost serving its own purpose. But I am a huge believer in the power of technology. I mean, it saved my life this year, and it was so kind of instrumental in my own life kind of in previous years. I'm not a Luddite in any particular way, and I worked at Google. So I do know how much technology can offer to us. But like any other things in our lives, we have to approach it with a bit of a kind of a cool mind, a cool head as well, to really know and be able to distinguish when a particular set of technologies is actually doing the societal damage as well. And say, okay, how can we amplify the positive aspects of it and attenuate the negative aspects of it, instead of just completely blindly buying the ideological position that every technology in its own right is completely good. It's just good and nothing else.
Absolutely. So if we don't have any more questions, I think it's time to close today's session. And I wholeheartedly thank. Oh, do we have another one? Sorry, I have some assistants here who are telling me that. So please speak up if anyone wants to, if anyone has a question, or I can't see actually a hand raised. Anyway, so I was saying, actually, I was thanking our guest speaker. Thank you, Lazar, very much. You engaged our audience, and I think everyone is satisfied with what we heard and learned today. And I hope that this discussion be continued, that we all engage as good citizens and try to explain to each other from our different perspectives, worldviews, what we see ahead of us and how we can overcome all those obstacles, and maybe this depersonalization of a human, and getting people back to communities, working together on things that make our world better and more safe, and engaging in consuming more culture, and really consuming good things that make us human.
Oh, absolutely, all for that. Thank you very much once again for inviting me. It was lovely, and thank you very much to Milena for actually connecting us together,
Likewise.
making this
Thank you.
possible. Thank you for the comments and thank you for the questions, and really hoping to be able to see you soon again. All the best, Merry Christmas, and really all the best in the new year, privately and professionally as well.
Thank you. Same to you.
Okay, bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.